Welcome to the 11th video in the series on the communist mode production according to Marx and Engels. Today we'll be going over the 1894 piece by Marx, Capital Volume III, Part 7, Revenues and Their Sources, Chapter 48, The Trinity Formula. I've subtitled this, Metabolic Rift is Repaired, Nature and Humanity are Synchronized. Due to the private monopolization of sections of society, controlled by the bourgeoisie, the means of production gain a character that appears independent of the actual labor power working upon it. This produces a mystical, social form of social production, and capital, the product of labors, also in turn appears to be independent, ruling over both the producer and the bourgeois, who buys the labor power to produce it. This independent mystical character causes capital, the means of production, and labor itself to take on a mystified condition of fetishism, where an agency of people is alienated away from them and placed into products of society outside of our control. In contrast, production under communism is not independent of the producers, but directly held by them, with the conditions of production being dictated by the workers themselves, within the limits of material reality. Thus, it does not have a mystical form, wherein workers lack the ability to make decisions about production and consider it natural, alien, and unchanging, but rather it is fully under control. There is no fetishism, no loss of human agency at any point in communism. Communism needs only recognize the elements of the real labor process, which are fundamentally only two: land, or nature, and labor. The land, like capital, appears to be independent from the people actually working and living upon it, and demands a portion of the product created by those people, quote, with its help. The land, like capital, appears to be independent from the people actually working and living upon it, and demands a portion of the product created by those people, quote, with its help. Only in capitalism, the land is the landlord, and so the land does not receive its due, but the landlord takes profit. In a rational communist mode production, land that is being extracted from, especially due to its high productivity, would have extra care and labor spent in maintaining and improving its carrying capacity, so as to minimize human labor needed to maintain society, rather than land appearing as independent and outside of the control of people laboring and living upon it, is instead socially and directly held in common. In capitalism, surplus labor, labor performed over and above the requirements of reproduction, appears as surplus value, and surplus value exists materially as surplus product. For the worker in capitalism, surplus labor is anathema and competes with their own labor. The harder they work, the less valuable their work becomes. That's why all societies, or even simple individuals or animals, producing surplus product. Capitalism forces surplus labor in a way that is advantageous to the development of productive forces, social relations, and developing labor and land beyond previous modes of production. However, in doing so, it also creates the conditions for the coercion and monopolization of social development by the bourgeoisie over the proletariat. At the same time, it also makes it possible materially and socially to combine surplus labor with lowered laboring times to produce the same amount. This makes communism possible. In communism, surplus labor is its own reward. The more one works, the more they will have and the more society has, which they receive in turn. This surplus labor, now simply surplus product, is needed for insurance against accidents and for necessary and progressive expansion of reproduction in order to keep up with increasing demand and population, thus accumulating more. Thus, in communism, surplus labor and product will exist, but will be something that people seek to do of their own accord. It will need a certain minimum to act as insurance and to develop above and beyond current society, but all surplus labor comes back to labor directly or indirectly. Communism maximizes surplus labor by way of minimized required labor times to reproduce society through the following, and likely more, in order to reach the point wherein it is, quote, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Now, I've expressed a list here that I will now read through but this isn't actually expressed in the text. I just felt like this was a good place to put this, and I think that is worthwhile to have, even if it isn't in the actual textual summary itself. 1. Production for social use with a planned production. 2. Maximal use of productive forces, especially the full recognition of labor in a fully direct way, removing fetters on all of them, which specifically, constantly, and continuously is stated to be the case by Marx to include the land, nature in this case, including all chemical processes, the air, and so on. 3. Direct, real, structural interest in actually producing and innovating, and the maximization of both in the interests of human, social desire, especially which is in terms of increasing leisure time, reducing the amount of time necessary for society to labor on unfulfilling and unwanted work, and so on. 4. Full development of individuals, the bringing of all human population into scientific society such that they can reach their full individual development in complete, with real education, with dialectical pedagogy, and without a social division of labor. 5. Extreme long-term organization of labor to build large-scale production. 6. Full centralization of production and economies of scale with universalization of production. 7. Global access to productive forces, land, labor, and so on. Nations no longer being in conflict with one another, but instead within a world republic which distributes forces of production wherever the best fit naturally befit, and organizing global supply chains without overhead costs. 8. No more contradiction in production, such as between labor and the development of the forces of production. Workers recognize automation as a threat to their lives under capitalism. Under communism, automation is liberation. All society has shared interest in the developing and putting them into use as widely as possible. 9. The end of hoarding and the end of speculation, while the productive forces gain maximal dynamism of movement. It does not require advances of money capital in order to mobilize capitals, and therefore labor to work on projects, or the resulting necessities of credit systems, stock companies, or the like. Instead, it is direct and socially determined. 10. The end of crisis of overproduction, because all surplus is brought back in, never taking on a character of surplus value, only surplus product. 11. The end of the labor relation, along with a direct, real, structural interest in actually producing and innovating, and the maximization of both in the interests of human, social desire, while social reason is presupposed, rather than asserting itself after the fact, post hoc. For example, the market determined that such and such business would work here. 12. End a boom-bust cycle that's allowing constant development. 13. Money ceases being a constraint on consumption. With the direct needs of society becoming known without mediating force, production can be carried out to meet real consumption. 14. Time becomes a basis for economization. Degrowth and reconstruction of society for maximal efficiency to reduce the amount of labor time of the individual worker, increasing number of shifts while minimizing working hours. Mind you, I prefer the term regrowth, by the way. 15. The end of the division between town and country, the urban and rural divide, uneven and combined development, and in addition, also the end of imperialism and colonialism, and thus the liberation of the productive forces. The metabolic rift is repaired. 16. The end of the division of labor, which converts man from a universal and complete human into one who is shaped into a tool for a particular mental and physical kind of labor with a limited ability to conceive of the world. 17. The end of classes, and therefore the necessary basis for the existence of a state to enforce class relations. The end of a section of the population with direct material interests to create systems to subjugate the other classes, and so on. 18. The direct recognition of nature as a producer of value and not a, quote, free gift, as capital perceives it, with a highly developed agronomy allowing for increasing carrying capacities and minimize inefficiency. Unification of man, nature, and community with the end of alienation. 19. The end of the domination of dead labor over living labor, and a class of people who seek to maintain their primacy and control over the productive forces and thereby the workers. There ceases being a necessary drive towards the productive forces being out of sync with their natural boundaries. 20. A scientific society becomes possible, one which harnesses all natural resources, primarily renewable ones, which require no minimal labor to access once being obtained, such as gravity, wind, solar, and so on, in order to minimize labor time to merely acting as a watchman of processes of nature while living as a part of them. This becomes possible. No more ruling class which is naturally conservative and seeks to direct development of the productive forces in a way that is useful to them, but not the rest of society, stymieing development for their own interests. 22. Focusing on reducing costs by preventative social and material measures, for example, highly efficient trains, rather than individual cars and the infrastructure necessary to support such. 23. Integration of diverse cultures and societies, resulting in the whole world benefiting from the knowledge, experience, and social products of the totality of human and of nature, and many more besides. Wherever capitalism does any of these, it does so under false cylinders such as money capital, the anarchy of the market and world market, etc., in ways that make it impossible or extremely difficult for capitalists to come together to produce anything large-scale and long-term. Freedom only actually becomes possible when labor determined by necessity and mundane consideration ceases, when scarcity of necessities ends. Freedom itself lies beyond the sphere of actual material production. Therefore, communism, which liberates man from labor, is the only social organization which can bring about freedom. As society develops, of any kind, necessity increases in turn. The needs and wants of socialized and modern man is far greater than any previous age, and so too will the needs and wants of those in communist society be far more developed and extensive. This has occurred in capitalism too, which has only resulted in continually increasing labor time required to give the bourgeoisie their cut to maintain power relations and the continual immiserating of the workers who produce the wealth of the world. To reiterate, it is only communism which can liberate mankind from labor. This increase in wants and needs requires greater forces of production, and thereby it requires socialized man who acts as associated producers. These producers must rationally regulate their interchange with nature and bring it under common control rather than being ruled by it, and this must be done with the minimum expenditure of energy in the most dignified manner possible, while shortening the working day to reproduce society as much as possible. With these, the minimization of human labor to reproduce society, freedom becomes possible for mankind to labor as they wish without coercion by any force, material or social. Labor, that is, purposive, productive activity, directly relates to the means of production, the concrete materials and means of labor which are distinguished only by their use materially, whether they have been refined by previous human labor or not. Under capitalism, due to the dynamics of society, the means of labor are perceived as capital, and land is perceived as landed property, and the dynamics make it materially so. However, the dependence of labor, purposive, productive activity, exists and is unique, as labor acts as macro constraint, can be withheld, and so on. Thus, human labor, regardless of conditions of production it finds itself in, is fundamentally an element of production while the condition of labor is not. Under communism, labor as the element of production is fully recognized and unfettered, and for communal society, the reproduction of communal society appears as a purpose for production. Production is to reproduce the community, not for exchange, not for profit, not for war, for the community, and through the community, the individual, their direct desires without alienation, for passion itself, which affirms all parties, objectifies the producer's individuality in a sensuous manner, fulfills their social, spiritual, intellectual, personal needs, and becomes the free manifestation of life and its prime want. And that is my summary of the Capital Volume 3, Part 7, Revenues and Their Sources, Chapter 48, the Trinity Formula. If you'd like to go through the quotations that I derived this from, or take a closer look at my list here, then please feel free to go to the description below and open up the shared Google Doc. It's all in there. If you would like to discuss this in greater detail or are interested, there is also the Discord server, the United Marxist Pact, and we would be glad to discuss this with anybody who comes in. Tomorrow we will be going through Marx's 1872 piece, The Nationalization of Land. Thank you for joining me for today's topical summary, and I hope to see you tomorrow.